This is units 5.8 and 5.16, fisheries and aquaculture. Fishery is a commercially harvestable population of fish within a particular ecological region. So, of course, fish live lots of places in the ocean, but not all of them are commercially harvestable. Um, Asia and Africa get a lot of consumed animal protein from fish. It's a fairly common source of protein for those people. Um, so there's been rapid increase in farm fish production and a consequent decrease in the amount of wild fish caught in the world's ocean. Earlier, we talked about the tragedy of the commons, and one of these issues is especially in regards to fisheries. So fisheries in the open ocean don't belong to any nation, and so there's really no incentive for anyone to protect them. So consequently, there's been a precipitous decline in fish populations as the Earth's human population has, exploded over the last century. We've seen collapses of lots of fisheries. If you'll notice, there's a fair amount of species richness, around the coasts of different continents, and yet we've seen the species richness decline pretty precipitously. So declines of fish population, we see like 90% or more decline of fish population. Fisheries that have collapsed, in other words, they're no longer commercially harvestable. There's only 70% of those fisheries left. And this is just measuring from 1950. Who knows what it was before that? It was a lot harder to measure, but we've seen in the last 70 years declines, like we're saying, 30% and like 70%. So global trends in the world's marine fish stocks, 74 to 2015. 30% are overfished, right? And so have collapsed. Underfished is really down to just like 10%. And, biologically sustainable fisheries were only down to 70% of what there was, 70 years ago, or 50 years ago, excuse me. So how do we catch these fish? Why are we so good at it? Because we do catch a lot. You have these large ships, they're considered factory ships. They catch, process, and freeze the fish at sea, and they stay out at sea for months because they can do all these different parts of the fishing process. And those are big boats, pretty big boats. Another modern harvesting method are trawling, drag nets, and long lines. So a diagram of a long line. You have all these long lines, and they've got hooks. Lots and lots of hooks, like 3,000 hooks. But the animals that try to get the bait from these long lines aren't necessarily the fish that the fishers are looking for. So you can get sea turtles, seabirds, and sharks, getting onto these long lines, but the fishermen don't want all these extra fish. Can also search for fish using spotting planes and sonar, so they can detect schools of fish, and then fishing boats can go after them. There's a fair amount of environmental damage that's caused by commercial fishing. So one is the destruction of seafloor habitat. So some of these trawlers, they could be ocean bottom trawlers, so they literally scrape their nets across the bottom of the ocean using weights. And of course, all that scraping and the weights destroys the seafloor habitat. Coral reefs are physically destroyed, seagrass is ripped out, that kind of thing. Another type of environmental damage is bycatch. So juveniles, right, that are not big enough to sell, like they get caught. Non-target species, you might be looking for tuna, but you catch something else. You don't want that other thing. What happens to that? And so that gets removed from the habitat, but then not replaced. One way to avoid bycatch are technology methods. So, for example, this is what's called a turtle exclusion device. And how it works is that you have these nets that are designed to catch shrimp, which are small. But if you put the turtle exclusion device in there and then provide a way for the turtle to get out, the shrimp go through the grate, they get caught in the net, but the turtles get pushed out and so escape from the net. If you're trying to figure out which types of fish are environmentally sustainable and which ones are not, here's a good list. So you should definitely avoid things that you should avoid. Sharks, right? Please don't eat shark. Farmed Atlantic salmon, which, for the most part is salmon that's sold in grocery stores, but you should avoid eating it. Certain types of tuna. There are environmentally sustainable ways to fish tuna, so you should check those out. There are good alternatives to that. So halibut, wild-caught salmon is a good alternative to farmed salmon. Swordfish is kind of high in mercury, so I don't know that I would eat swordfish just because it's so high up in the food web. But certain kinds of tuna are good. And then best choices, check out catfish is always good, Pacific cod, certain kinds of rockfish, farm scallops are fine, and tilapia, whitefish, lake whitefish, I should say. So check this out. Second part of this screencast is aquaculture. So this is breeding, rearing, harvesting of fish, algae, plants, all of the organisms in water environments by people in more controlled environments. So when you talk about fish farming, there are ways we can do this. So you can have tanks that people have made, other enclosures where the fish literally live inside the enclosures. We see this commonly with catfish, tilapia, salmon, carp, cod, trout. In this case, like this particular picture, you can see these tanks are located on a river. That's where the water comes from, but the enclosures are completely made by people and the fish can't get out of the enclosures. Another common way to do this is to create enclosures that are off the ocean, right? Mariculture. And what tends to happen here is these grates or these cages sit in the ocean, and the fish can kind of get in and out up until the point where they're too big, and then they can't get out anymore. And so then they have to stay in the enclosures. These are seawater tanks or ponds. We see this most commonly with things like flounder, shellfish like shrimp and oysters, kelp and seaweed. So the benefits of aquaculture, it's very efficient, it's very cost effective. It doesn't require it requires a little bit of fuel, but not like sending boats out into the ocean to farm. It requires much smaller areas of water, and of course there's less habitat destruction. You can see some other benefits on this diagram, such as mitigating pollution, provisioning of habitat, supporting fish populations, also reducing local climate change impacts. So some numbers for you, production highlights of aquaculture. So how much money goes into or you get out of production of certain types of sea life. These are the top 5 cultured species, aquaculture species in the US: oysters, clams, salmon, shrimp, and mussels. And you can see in aquaculture, like millions of tons, for different countries. China, Peru, Chile, Japan, all are big producers of aquaculture. A lot of human coastal communities can grow around the economics of aquaculture. So not only are the organisms grown on the coasts, but then they need places to process all that food, to freeze it, and then carry it out. There has to be agriculture to produce food to support those organisms, so that happens also. Aquaculture is not all benefits, unfortunately. So a major drawback is that fish feces and waste feed contamination in the water is a problem because it gets very concentrated in very small areas. Um, there can be the spread of disease and parasites. Remember when we talked in population about density dependent limiting factors? So disease and parasites crop up and get concentrated when you have all these fish living in a very small area. Um, and then finally, farm fish can escape. And this is a challenge because they have a certain genetic structure, and they might outcompete, right? They could be considered invasive species, so they might outcompete native species, or in some ways worse, they might breed with the native species, and then the native species, become different, right? We have different genetic structure. So these are all potential drawbacks of aquaculture. Some other environmental risks, we talked about diseases, so it's possible to add drugs like antibiotics and other things to help prevent the disease, but then those get into the water as well. Um, Herbicides, if there's too much algal growth on the net pens, then, that can contaminate the water. Um, and then you can see some of these other things that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago: escape of non-native species, new diseases, um, waste fish sewage at the bottom. Another way to approach aquaculture is what's called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, IMTA. So the advantage of this is that all trophic levels of the food chain are cultivated, not just one particular species. So the waste nutrients are used to feed lower levels. And so that helps support other parts of the food web, not just the fish that we're looking for. So that's a slightly more sustainable way to do aquaculture. And aquaculture itself may be a more sustainable way to raise fish. Right, well, those are units 5.8 and 5.16. Please let me know what questions you have.